Last week, seemingly out of nowhere, Riot updated the bios of Nasus and Renekton. Personally, I think there were multiple reasons why they had done it, with the most obvious one being the Shurima expansion for Legends of Runeterra. We know that, starting in March, we will get a big Shuriman event that will stretch throughout the next few months. And because of an unfortunate leak, we know that Renekton and Nasus, together with Azir, will be the champions representing the region. But the other reason why Riot may have updated their story is because we know that one of the future champions will be a Light Sentinel from Shurima. So there is the chance that Riot just wants to lay down the path for the story to come. Either way, I am happy to have a look at these two again, because the last time we have covered their canon story was about 4 years ago. So finally, let's go back to the first properly related champions that ever existed in League of Legends. Long before he was chosen to become an Ascended, Nasus was recognized as a brilliant student. He memorized and critiqued the greatest works of Shuriman history and philosophy before he was 10. However, this kind of passion was not shared by his younger brother Renekton, who usually got quickly bored, and instead he fought the other local children. Nonetheless, the brothers were close, and Nasus kept an eye on Renekton, ensuring he didn't get into too much trouble. When he came of age, Nasus was welcomed into the prestigious and exclusive Collegium of the Sun. He had the best teachers in the Empire, and developed a keen understanding of military strategy and logistics, eventually becoming the youngest general in history. While being a decent soldier, his genius lay not in fighting battles, but in planning them. Being a deeply empathetic man, Nasus took his responsibilities seriously, and he always made sure his soldiers were treated fairly. He guided the Emperor's mortal armies to countless victories, and he was respected by all who served beneath him. Sure enough, his brother Renekton also entered the military, and he rose through the ranks as a trusty and capable warrior under Nasus's command. But despite all of the triumphs, Nasus did not enjoy war. He understood its importance, for now at least in the Empire's rapid expansion. But he believed his greatest contribution to the Shurima was the knowledge they could gather and preserve in the wake of each conquest. At his urging, all the books, scrolls and teachings of the cultures they defeated were added to the libraries throughout the Empire, to bring wisdom and enlightenment to generations still to come. After decades of service, Nasus was cruelly struck by a terrible wasting sickness, and his physician declared that General Nasus would be dead within a week. The people of Shurima mourned the news, for Nasus was their brightest star and beloved by all. The Emperor himself pleaded with Setaka, the leader of the Ascended God Warriors, for Nasus's deeds to be weighed before the Sun Disk. After a day and night, Setaka's emissaries confirmed that Nasus would be blessed with Ascension, and despite the sickness, he would immediately undergo the ritual. Renekton, now a war leader in his own right, raced home to be with his brother. He was shocked to find Nasus's flesh wasted away, his bones fragile as glass. So weak was he that as the Sun Disk's golden radiance streamed over the dice, Nasus was unable to climb the final steps into the light. Renekton's love for his brother was stronger than any sense of self-preservation, and so, despite him not being chosen by the Sun Disk, he carried the weakly protesting Nasus onto the dice and into the light, ready to accept oblivion. Normally, when an unworthy individual steps into the light of the Sun Disk, they are annihilated or turned into abominations. However, Renekton was not destroyed as expected. When the light faded, not one, but two God Warriors emerged. Both brothers had not only survived, but flourished. Nasus stood as a towering, jackal-headed avatar of wisdom and strength, while Renekton was a muscled behemoth in the likeness of a crocodile. Nasus had been gifted with powers far beyond mortal understanding. The greatest trait of his ascension was the countless lifetimes he could now spend in study and contemplation, though this would eventually come to be his greatest curse. But he was more immediately concerned by the increased savagery he saw within Renekton. At the siege of Nashrame, finally bringing the city under Shuriman rule, Nasus learned that his brother had destroyed the Grand Library and massacred all who stood against him. This was the closest the two brothers came to bloodshed, facing one another in the rubble, weapons drawn. It was only after Renekton saw the disappointment in Nasus's eyes that his bloodshed disappeared and he turned away in shame. Years later, the war with the rebels of Icathia started, and the events changed many of the Ascended. The horrors they witnessed left them hollow and quicker to anger. Nasus undertook centuries of solitary study as he tried to comprehend what had happened to his Ascended brethren and what it could mean for the future. But before he could figure out a way to deal with the Icathian corruption settled in the minds of the Ascended, Emperor Azir undertook the ritual of Ascension. But it went terribly wrong. Nasus and Renekton were both far from the capital and returned as fast as possible, but they were too late. Over the bodies of countless dead Shurimans, they fought Xerath. It turned out that twisted malevolent being of pure energy had betrayed Azir, and somehow Nasus and Renekton were unable to slay him. Filled with rage and perhaps seeking to atone for Nashrame, Renekton wrestled Xerath into the tomb of the emperors beneath the city, bidding Nasus to seal them in. Nasus refused, desperate to find another way, but there was none. And so, with a heavy heart, he locked Xerath and his brother in the fathomless darkness for all eternity. Drained of its power by Xerath's sorcery, the Sun Disk fell, and every remaining god warrior felt its loss in their immortal hearts. The divine waters flowing from the city's oasis ran dry, bringing death to all Shurima. For a time, the other Ascended tried to hold the fractured empire together before their countless rivalries led them to fight among themselves. Withdrawing entirely, Nasus bore a heavy burden of guilt, stalking the empty ruins that were slowly being swallowed by the desert, and lamenting everything that had been lost. Centuries passed, and Nasus all but forgot his former life and purpose, until the moment when the tomb of the emperors was rediscovered by mortals, and its seal broken. He did not know how, but he knew Xerath was free. Ancient vigor reawakened in Nasus, and yet he was stunned to see Azir reborn, and the Sun Disk raised once more from the sands. Though Xerath was still a grave threat, Nasus knew the new God Emperor would have great need of guidance and counsel in the years ahead. This was Nasus's bio. While not much has changed from what we already knew before, now the bio directly explains some of the things we had to learn from the other stories. For example, here the story explained how the Sun Disk fell and how the rivers went dry after Azir's death. And it was the drying of the rivers that really doomed the nation. Technically, this wasn't mentioned before. So I wonder if these waters will be related to Viego, who already has a funny past with waters. Also, I like how the story finally addressed the beginning of the Darkin. Here we learned that the Ascended were turned into the Darkin after their minds were touched by the Voidborn of Icathia, which was later followed by the death of the Emperor and the destruction of the Sun Disk, which apparently everyone felt. And with no clear heir to the Shuriman throne, of course the Ascended fought for the leadership. This started a conflict which slowly drove all the Ascended into madness and chaos. But even with these cool new details, some things weren't explained here. For example, if you wanna learn about what happened at the end there with Azir, you'll probably have to go and read the story of either Azir or Xerath. If you boil it all down, the main reason why Xerath pushed Azir from the light of the Sun Disk and decided to forcefully take its power is because even though Azir was beloved by everyone, he was still an emperor who had countless slaves carrying the empire. And since Xerath himself was a slave, he couldn't stand how Azir kept claiming how well the empire was doing, while forcing half of his nation to suffer. Unfortunately though, Azir did plan to release all the slaves. It was the first thing he wanted to do after he got ascended. But he didn't tell Xerath because he wanted to keep it a surprise. So theoretically, it was because Azir wanted to make Xerath happy that there was a misunderstanding and the entire empire was destroyed. Anyway, up until now, the story was told from Nasus's perspective. So let's have a look at some more context from Renekton's point of view. As we mentioned, while Nasus became a brilliant student, Renekton took a different path. From a young age, it was obvious Renekton had no fear, as he was brawling with much older children. It was usually his pride that led to these confrontations. Renekton was unable to back down or let any insult pass. But the fighting became even more serious after Nasus left to join the Collegium of the Sun. Things got so bad, Nasus was worried Renekton would be imprisoned for his violent nature. And so he helped Renekton join the Shuriman army. Officially, Renekton was too young to do so, but Nasus made sure that fact was overlooked. The discipline of military life was a blessing. Renekton fought in numerous wars of conquest to expand the empire. His ferocity and toughness were still evident, but his honor and bravery became renowned. Nasus, now a celebrated general and tactician, would often say that he planned many great battles, but it was Renekton who won them. Indeed, after saving the isolated city of Zurita, Renekton was made a captain by the Emperor himself, and named Gatekeeper of Shurima. Outnumbered 10 to 1, he and a small squad had faced the enemy in the remote rocky passes to the south, to buy time for the city to be evacuated. It was a battle none had expected Renekton to survive, let alone win. Yet he held out long enough for a relief force led by Nasus to arrive, and the invading forces were routed. Through decades of service, Renekton's reputation came to rival even the god warriors of the Ascended Host. His presence on the battlefield an inspiration to those fighting alongside him, and terrifying to his foes. Still, he was a grizzled and battle-scarred veteran of middling years, when word reached him that his brother was close to death. This is where the stories cross. Just like was explained in Nasus' story, Nasus was struck by deadly sickness, and so, in order for him to survive, he was chosen to become an Ascended. However, he was too weak to climb the steps. So, without a thought, Renekton picked him up, and that's how both brothers became Ascended warriors. So now, possessing a power beyond mortal understanding, Renekton led Shurima's armies to many bloody victories, neither giving nor expecting mercy. His legend spread far beyond the borders of the empire, and over time, among the enemy, he became known as the Butcher of the Sands. Unfortunately, many, including Nasus, noticed that Renekton embraced the title. And indeed, it became obvious that after his transformation, part of Renekton's humanity was lost, as he seemed crueler, taking ever greater pleasure in the spilling of blood. Still, he stayed loyal to the Empire, and he served many succeeding emperors. But as we know, things changed when young Emperor Azir was chosen to become an Ascended. So once again, as we learned from Nasus, Xerath betrayed Azir, he forcefully drained the Sun Disk of its power, he became a being of pure energy, and to protect the surviving Shurimans, Renekton wrestled him into the tomb of the Emperors, where Nasus locked both of them away. But here is where the story gets a new twist from Renekton's perspective. Xerath and Renekton continued their battle. For uncounted centuries, they stalked one another through the lightless depths, as the once great civilization of Shurima turned to dust in the world above. Xerath taunted Renekton, whispering poison in his ears, and gradually his words began to take hold. Xerath convinced Renekton that Nasus, jealous of his success, had leapt at the chance to be rid of him and enjoy immortality alone. Piece by piece, Renekton's sanity cracked. Xerath drove a wedge into these cracks, twisting his perception of what was real and what was imagined. When the tomb of the Emperors was finally opened by greedy mortal scavengers, Renekton roared his fury and thundered out into the desert, sniffing the air for his brother's scent. But Shurima has changed much in his absence. The Ascended Host was no more, leaving people scattered and leaderless for the most part, though he cared little for such things. Renekton has attracted followers among the most fierce and bloodthirsty of the desert raiders, even if he cannot always tell friend from foe in his frequent deranged frenzies. And while there were moments when he resembles the proud, honorable hero from the past, most often Renekton is little more than a devolved, hate-maddened beast, driven on by the thirst for blood and vengeance. And that was the story of Renekton. First of all, it is cool to see that just like the mortals used to gather around the Darkin and worship them as gods, in the current days, Renekton got his own following, and I have no doubt these followers will appear as cards in Legends of Runeterra. Also, notice how the story never mentioned Sivir. We know that Sivir comes from Azir's bloodline, so she is still definitely connected to Azir's resurrection. However, instead of Sivir and Cassiopeia being the ones who opened the tomb, here the story refers to them as greedy scavengers. So because Sivir is not even hinted at here, it is possible that the way the tomb was opened was tweaked, and it is something we may learn about in the future. Honestly, this change wouldn't surprise me, as the original Sivir and Cassiopeia story is 6 years old. It came before the map and even before the universe website, but somehow, up until today, it was kept canon. Lastly, the story mentioned that Renekton served many different emperors, and knowing Riot's attention to detail, I wouldn't be surprised if this fact was hinted by the other Shuriman cards too.